Huh. Fools. They said portraits don't speak, that they're just static reflections of pigment and canvas, dead images meant to mimic life. But when they carried yours into the halls where the world's greatest visionaries gathered, something ruptured in the air, not a sound, not a flash, a rupture that pressed against their ribs like a hand from the other side. They looked into the frame, and instead of brushstrokes, they swore they saw movement. Instead of an image, they swore they saw an opening. And in that instant, the 8 minds who had shaped industries, cracked codes, and rewritten the very narrative of progress were staggered not by logic, but by fear. They did not see a portrait. They saw a warning. The courier who carried it into the room thought it would be just another session, another indulgent display where powerful men and women gave detached critiques of form and symmetry. Instead, he watched as hands trembled, pupils dilated, and their voices fell into the kind of hush people usually reserve for confession. One by one, the most unshakable individuals alive leaned closer, searching, scanning, as though the paint itself contained coordinates to something forbidden. A sculptor who had once been celebrated as untouchable was the first to step back, muttering that the image carried weight. Not metaphorical weight, actual weight, as though if he stood near it long enough, his spine might collapse under pressure no human should feel. What unsettled them most wasn't beauty. Beauty they could analyze. It wasn't genius. Genius they could categorize. What unsettled them was that your portrait contained no trace of the ordinary. It wasn't a reflection of flesh and blood. It was an echo of something outside of chronology, something that refused to be trapped by oil canvas or human hands. They claimed your gaze bent around the room like a weaponized mirror, ricocheting into each of their lives, surfacing things they had buried for decades. In your portrait, they did not see you. They saw themselves unraveling. One visionary, a painter notorious for mocking everything sacred, tried to dismiss it as exaggeration. He approached, chin raised, arrogance intact. But when his eyes locked with yours on the canvas, the arrogance cracked. He staggered, whispering that he felt watched not by you, but by a presence standing directly behind him. He refused to turn around. Instead, he left the room, mumbling about doors opening where there were none. The others didn't mock him. They didn't laugh. They only stared harder, afraid that what stalked him might bleed into them too. Understand this. These were not fragile minds. These were men and women who thrived in chaos, who dissected human psychology like surgeons, who had spent lifetimes shielding themselves from superstition. Yet one by one, they admitted the same thing. Your portrait wasn't painted. It was summoned. And in that summoning, they felt an ancient shield descend over you. Not metaphor, not poetry, an active barrier that pulsed like a heartbeat. They claimed it repelled them, not with hostility, but with recognition, as if it whispered, "This one is not yours to touch." The sculptor spoke first, voice shaking. He said he'd carved marble statues that outlived generations, but never once had stone looked back at him. Until now. He swore your portrait tilted as he moved, following him like prey marked by a predator. Another visionary, one who had pioneered technologies that mapped the human mind, whispered that when she studied the portrait, she didn't see features. She saw patterns, encrypted threads of geometry that mirrored the very wiring of the brain. She swore that what stared back was not skin and eyes, but an intelligence coded into paint, an encryption only time itself could have authored. The room shifted. They were no longer critics, no longer the ones holding authority. They were subjects, witnesses to something that had reduced them to initiates. They swore your portrait wasn't passive, it was active, not decoration, invocation. They whispered that whoever captured your likeness must have been guided, because no human hand could replicate what wasn't flesh, but essence. As minutes bled into hours, the fear mutated into reverence. None of them dared touch the frame. None of them dared cover it. They stood in a circle, whispering fragments of old languages, words they hadn't spoken in years. One called it a shield. Another called it a guardian. Another claimed it wasn't protecting you. It was protecting the world from you. Because if the shield ever lifted, if the barrier ever broke, they believed the raw force behind your portrait would surge out and rewire everything it touched. By the second hour, they weren't arguing anymore. They were confessing. Each admitted to feeling their chest tighten, their thoughts disrupted, their memories flashing in fragments. A composer swore he heard music woven into the strokes, a low frequency buried inside the pigments, a resonance that vibrated his bones. A poet clutched his wrist and claimed he felt words rearranging under his skin, letters scratching from the inside out. None of it could be measured. None of it could be disproved. But every one of them walked out of that room altered. The courier who carried the frame swore the air was heavier when he left than when he entered. He claimed the portrait's weight had multiplied, as though it had absorbed fragments of those who gazed upon it. When he tried to look himself, he found nothing extraordinary until he blinked. Then he saw after-images burned into his eyelids, 8 faces, pale, drained, shaking, swearing that what they saw wasn't imagination, but revelation. And here's the fracture you need to notice. These visionaries were never aligned before. They competed, mocked, and despised one another. Yet for the first time, they agreed unanimously. They swore without hesitation that a force older than their knowledge shields you. Not shields your name, not shields your reputation, shields you. And they said anyone who tries to pierce that shield will find themselves dismantled, not by retaliation, but by collapse from within. What unnerved them most wasn't the shield itself, but what it implied. If protection that powerful surrounds you, then what exactly are you carrying that requires it? What secret does the universe guard so fiercely that even its most gifted observers flinch at a reflection of your face? They couldn't answer. They wouldn't answer. Some refused to speak entirely, leaving the room like prisoners released from a vision they weren't built to endure. But the whispers spread beyond the walls. Assistants, curators, and guards overheard fragments of their panic. Stories leaked into corridors, and soon people were murmuring not about the portrait itself, but about you. About the force that shields you. About the invisible barrier that bends even the sharpest minds. They swore the portrait wasn't just a painting. It was proof. Proof that you are guarded by something they can't define, something they can't touch, something that makes even the most brilliant recoil. And this is where the first fracture turns into contagion. Because the 8 didn't just witness your portrait, they carried it with them. In their minds, in their words, in their fear. Everywhere they went, they spread the story, and with it, the recognition that you are untouchable not because of what you do, but because of what surrounds you. They became unwilling heralds, carrying news they never intended to deliver. And the world, upon hearing, began to shift. Because when the unshakable swear they've been shaken, when the skeptics swear they've been pierced, when the most brilliant admit they've been humbled, that's when the story stops being rumor and starts becoming law. And from that moment forward, the portrait isn't just a canvas anymore. It's a boundary, a declaration, a signal that your image carries weight too great to be dismissed, too sharp to be ignored. And yet this is only the beginning, because what happens next isn't confined to a single room, or 8 visionaries, or one portrait. What happens next is how the world responds when whispers turn into echoes, and echoes turn into doctrine. Because once the tale spreads beyond those who witnessed it firsthand, it grows teeth. And those teeth bite deeper than paint ever could. And that's where we continue. Because the story doesn't end with 8 shaken visionaries. That was only the ignition. The true unraveling begins when their confessions leak, when the world realizes the portrait isn't just an image of you, it's a mirror of what shields you. And what shields you doesn't just defend, it challenges, it declares, it rearranges the hierarchy of power itself. The first fracture came quietly, like a whisper traveling through corridors meant to keep secrets buried. An assistant to one of the visionaries carried a single line outside the chamber. They swore the portrait isn't human. That sentence was never meant to escape. But once it did, it traveled with a speed no containment could match. Soon, another assistant described pale faces, shaking hands, and the strange chant of words in languages older than paper. The leaks multiplied. And before long, journalists began circling, their curiosity sharpened by the scent of fear radiating from those who normally wore arrogance like armor. Headlines never mentioned your name at first. They only spoke about the portrait. Rumors claimed it carried weight. Others claimed it disrupted heartbeats. A few swore it bent perception itself. Most dismissed it as artistic exaggeration. But then came the detail no one could ignore. The 8 visionaries had sworn, unanimously, that an ancient shield cloaked the one in the frame. 8 individuals who had never agreed on anything in their careers aligned in fear, reverence, and awe. That alignment was more shocking than any pigment or stroke. People asked, what kind of force makes rivals abandon their egos and speak with one voice? The answer spread faster than the question. The shield, the barrier, the presence that guards you. The revelation wasn't controlled. It wasn't packaged neatly for consumption. It leaked raw, fractured like shards of glass, cutting through rumor. One claimed the shield hummed like static around the frame. Another swore it pulsed in rhythm with a heartbeat too deep to belong to any human. A third admitted to waking in the night, hearing the portrait whisper through his dreams. None of them coordinated their stories, yet the threads aligned too perfectly to be dismissed as fiction. And soon, the whispers shifted tone. It wasn't, "Did you hear about the portrait?" anymore. It became, "Do you understand who the shield is protecting?" That's when your name began to circulate. At first quietly, through encrypted channels and late-night conversations between those too afraid to say it aloud in daylight. But when one of the visionaries vanished from public view, rumors exploded. They said he locked himself away, refusing to speak to anyone. When asked why, his only answer was, "I stared too long, and now the shield stares back." Governments took notice. Intelligence agencies, accustomed to monitoring threats of steel and fire, began analyzing whispers about a portrait as though it were a weapon. They dispatched analysts to trace the story, to map the origins, to identify whether the shield was metaphor or machinery. But the deeper they dug, the more resistance they faced. Files corrupted, testimonies contradicted themselves, and those who tried to debunk it found themselves unsettled, plagued by unease they couldn't rationalize. The portrait was no longer an artifact. It was becoming a doctrine. The narrative shifted from something strange to something undeniable. Not because everyone believed, but because disbelief no longer carried weight against the collective fear of the Eight. Their reputations were the fuel. Their surrender was the spark. And the fire spread across industries, communities, borders. People began to ask themselves what the shield meant. Was it protection for you? Was it a barrier against forces too dangerous to unleash? Or was it a declaration that you were not just another human, but a vessel of something beyond chronology? Each question sharpened the edge of your presence. Each interpretation lifted you higher in the architecture of fear and reverence. And here's the pivot that destabilized the world. The 8 visionaries, once pillars of certainty, became symbols of collapse. Their trembling hands, their shaken voices, their confessions turned into proof that the shield surrounding you was more powerful than their genius combined. What they had built for decades could crumble under one glance at your likeness. If they couldn't stand against it, who could? That's when the public obsession ignited, not with art, but with you. Who are you? Why does the shield surround you? What truth requires such defense? Theories erupted. Some claimed you were chosen. Others claimed you were cursed. A few whispered you were both, chosen to carry a force that curses anyone who dares approach. Every theory circled back to the same root. The portrait proved you are untouchable. Markets shifted. Collectors who once paid fortunes for the visionaries' works suddenly devalued them, whispering that their brilliance had been eclipsed. Instead, underground networks began offering sums beyond comprehension for even a fragment of your portrait. Not the original. Even rumors of reproductions were enough to spark bidding wars. People wanted proximity, believing the shield extended through representation, as if even an echo of you carried protection. This is where fear morphed into power. Because whispers don't just entertain, they reorganize. They restructure hierarchies. Institutions that once dismissed you began re-evaluating. Analysts tracked the surge in conversations tied to your name. Politicians were briefed on the implications of an individual shielded by a force beyond time. Some scoffed. Others demanded reports. But even the scoffers couldn't ignore the way their staff hesitated before speaking of you, as though uttering your name might draw the shield's attention. The shield became more than defense. It became leverage, a concept that rewired how power was distributed. Corporations debated whether supporting or opposing you carried risk. Philosophers wrote papers arguing that you redefined the boundary between image and essence. And in every debate, one truth remained unshakable. The portrait had changed the world. Not through bullets, not through laws, but through disruption at the core of belief. And yet the 8 themselves refused to speak further. Each was asked, pressured, cornered into giving interviews. But they remained silent, shaking their heads, their eyes carrying the kind of terror usually reserved for soldiers returning from war. Their refusal spoke louder than their words ever could. The absence of denial was the loudest confirmation of all. By now, your portrait wasn't just a painting locked in a chamber. It was a phenomenon, a story retold in bars, in lecture halls, in boardrooms, in whispered conversations between leaders who feared losing their grip. And everywhere the story traveled, it carried the same haunting echo. An ancient force shields you. But this is where the shift grows even sharper. Because the shield wasn't just spoken about, it began to be felt. Those who lingered near reproductions claimed their dreams changed. Those who studied recordings of the portrait's unveiling claimed their bodies reacted. Chills, migraines, visions of shapes they couldn't describe. Some dismissed it as hysteria. Others whispered it was proof the shield's reach was not confined to space or proximity. The eight had been the first to feel it. But now the world was catching fragments, and every fragment only added weight to the truth. Your existence bends the structure of reality around it. And here's the fracture line that terrifies them most. Shields are not passive, they are selective, which means if you are guarded for a reason, and if the shield blocks intrusions, it also clears paths. Those who attempt to stop you may collapse. Those who align with you may find themselves lifted. And suddenly, allegiance to you wasn't a question of preference. It became a question of survival. Imagine what that does to the minds of those who have built empires on control. They thrive on leverage, manipulation, fear. But how do you control someone who carries a shield they cannot touch, cannot disarm, cannot override? How do you manipulate someone whose portrait alone dismantled 8 of the greatest visionaries alive? The answer is simple: you don't. And that realization gnaws at them like rot. That's why whispers aren't enough anymore. They've begun moving from disbelief to containment. Surveillance increases. Agents tail your movements. Dossiers are written not to understand you, but to predict whether the shield can be fractured. Yet each attempt collapses. Files disappear. Data corrupts. Witnesses contradict themselves until they lose credibility. Every failure reinforces the same conclusion. The shield doesn't just protect you, it disrupts those who try to uncover it. And here lies the paradox. The more they investigate, the more they prove its existence. The more they try to deny, the louder their failure echoes. The shield feeds on resistance. Every effort to dismantle it only multiplies its legend. Which means the portrait is no longer just an artifact of disruption. It is now a declaration written into the fabric of power. And that declaration has only begun to spread. Because beyond governments, beyond institutions, beyond the 8 visionaries, there are millions watching, millions waiting, millions whispering that if the shield exists, then everything they thought immutable is no longer secure. And you, the one it surrounds, don't have to move a muscle for this truth to grow. Your portrait alone destabilized hierarchies that once believed themselves eternal. The question that now rattles through every corridor of influence is not whether the shield exists. It's how long the world can function knowing it does. Because once you acknowledge that defense of this magnitude surrounds a single person, the rules change. Authority shifts. Power is rewritten, and the unraveling doesn't stop until every institution admits what the 8 visionaries already learned the hard way, that the shield guarding you is not just protection, it is dominance. A dominance no army, no theory, no decree can withstand. And that's where the fracture expands. Because this isn't just a story about art anymore. This is about what happens when the shield surrounding you begins to bleed into every layer of existence, politics, science, culture, and belief. The 8 saw it first. The world sees it now. And what comes next is not just recognition. It is submission. The shift started with whispers, but whispers are fragile. They scatter, they fade. Yet this time, they didn't. They multiplied, echoing from one continent to another, growing louder, heavier, impossible to silence. Leaders who once dismissed the story began noticing tremors in their own ranks. Military officials reported strange refusals to carry out orders whenever your name was mentioned. Scientists admitted their instruments malfunctioned when they tried to analyze images tied to you. And philosophers who had spent careers writing about abstractions confessed they felt themselves standing on unstable ground, as though the very definitions they clung to were dissolving under the weight of your portrait's proof. This wasn't just disruption, it was reconfiguration. The shield didn't simply protect you from attack, it bent the logic of those who considered attacking. It rewrote their willingness, it infected their certainty. And as each layer of resistance cracked, a deeper layer of submission took its place. What began as curiosity had hardened into reverence. News anchors tried to address it without trembling, but even their tone betrayed unease. They spoke of a new global presence, an unexplainable barrier, a force beyond chronology. Their words carefully stripped of direct acknowledgement, yet their eyes betrayed the same fear the 8 visionaries carried. The portrait's legend had outgrown the frame. It had become an atmospheric truth, saturating the world with the same undeniable recognition. You are guarded, and no measure of power can bypass it. But reverence is never quiet. Reverence creates demand. People wanted access. They wanted proof. They wanted fragments of the shield for themselves. Replicas of your portrait circulated like contraband, and wherever they appeared and phenomena followed. Families swore their homes felt impenetrable. Businesses claimed rivals collapsed without explanation. Soldiers carried prints under their uniforms, swearing the shield extended its reach. None of it could be verified, yet none of it could be disproved either. Belief itself had become reinforcement. Governments panicked. What they couldn't contain, they tried to reframe. They declared it cultural hysteria. They hired experts to dismiss it as illusion, but dismissal failed because dismissal requires confidence, and confidence had dissolved. Even skeptics faltered, their denials fragile, their voices hollow. People could see the cracks, and in those cracks, submission grew. The white visionaries themselves became symbols of this collapse. Their silence screamed louder than words. Each appearance, each photograph, showed faces drained, eyes hollow, bodies hunched by weight invisible to the rest of the world. They avoided questions, avoided interviews, avoided confrontation, and that avoidance became confession. The world read their silence as scripture. They were proof not of art, but of a shield too powerful to endure without consequence. And here is where the fracture widened into inevitability. Institutions began to pivot, no longer asking if the shield was real, but asking how to survive under it. No longer arguing if you were guarded, but strategizing what it meant to align with you. Nations quietly shifted alliances, not for resources or treaties, but for proximity to your name. Corporations funneled billions into research, not to disprove your portrait, but to adapt their futures around it. Universities constructed entire departments dedicated to studying the phenomenon of protective resonance. Their halls filled not with arrogance, but with awe. This wasn't worship, it was calculation, because the shield wasn't merely protection, it was leverage. And anyone with foresight understood the truth. If this barrier guarded you, then resisting you was suicide. Aligning with you was survival. That's when the submission began to crystallize into policy. Laws were rewritten, not in your name, but under its shadow. Leaders reshaped decisions with unspoken acknowledgement of you. Strategies shifted, campaigns rerouted, priorities reordered, all because of one portrait, one frame, one undeniable shield that echoed louder than entire armies. And this is the fracture that terrifies them most. You did nothing to demand this. No decree, no campaign, no announcement. The portrait alone reshaped the world's posture. The shield alone bent knees without commands. That's why the submission spreads faster than resistance. Because resistance requires strategy. Submission requires only recognition, and recognition is now irreversible. The 8 visionaries were the first to kneel without kneeling. Their trembling hands were the first wave. The second wave came when institutions bent. The third is here now, the masses. Ordinary men and women who feel the weight of the shield even from fragments of rumor. People whisper your name not as gossip, but as invocation. They speak of you not as an individual, but as an inevitability their lives must align around. Your portrait has dissolved the line between image and reality, between reflection and power. And now, the unraveling crosses its final threshold. Submission is no longer hidden, it is declared. Leaders admit they cannot govern against the presence of a shield that blocks their reach. Scientists admit they cannot measure it without their instruments breaking. Visionaries admit they cannot stare without shattering. And the masses admit they cannot hear your name without pausing, as though the air itself demands acknowledgement. The shield has bled into politics. It has bled into science. It has bled into culture. And it has bled into belief. Which means the story of your portrait is no longer story at all. It is law. A law unspoken yet enforced. A law no decree can override. A law rooted not in fear of punishment, but in recognition of dominance. And here is the paradox they choke on. The shield doesn't demand their loyalty. It doesn't speak. It doesn't command. Yet it bends them anyway. Submission without orders. Reverence without request. That is the purest form of dominance. And that is what terrifies them most. Because now, even the most powerful realize the truth. Armies can be defied. Governments can be resisted, wealth can be undermined, but a shield carried by time itself cannot be bypassed. And if that shield surrounds you, then resistance collapses into futility. That is why the 8 swore it aloud. That is why the world now whispers it in corridors. That is why submission spreads not as choice but as reflex. The unraveling has reached its endgame. Your portrait was the ignition. Their confessions were the kindling. The world's submission is the fire. And once fire consumes, there is no return to what was before. So the question is no longer whether they believe. The question is how long before they kneel openly. Because behind closed doors they already have. And the shield will not fade. It will not waver. It will not fracture. It will expand, pulling the world under its canopy until every institution, every culture, every voice accepts the same truth the 8 visionaries confessed first. You are guarded by a force beyond time, and nothing can override it. And that's where this story ends. Not with debate, not with doubt, but with submission. The 8 swore it, the world spread it, and now it stands unshakable. Your portrait didn't just stun visionaries, it rearranged the balance of power. It revealed the shield, and the shield revealed the truth. That dominance, once anchored in force and control, has now shifted forever into the shadow that surrounds you. You don't need to prove anything. The portrait proved enough. And from this moment on, every knee that trembles, every voice that falters, every hand that hesitates is proof of what they already know. You are not merely protected, you are enthroned, and the shield that cloaks you isn't just defense. It is the new center of gravity around which the world must orbit. The 8 saw it first. The world sees it now, and history will never forget it.